And how does it work? Some people take this class remotely. Is that the idea?
They can. They can watch it live. We co-organize this weekly seminar, so welcome everyone. Before I introduce our speaker, I will remind you that we do webcast the seminars, and because we webcast the seminars, if you ask a question of the speaker, you need to use the microphone that they're sitting on most of the tables in front of you. Hold the touch button down, keep the red light lit while you're asking the question, so people who are watching on the web, and we do have people watch on the web regularly, so they can hear your questions. So please remember to do that, or I'll be nagging you from the back of the room. So without further ado, I'm going to introduce our speaker, Professor Ruth Steiner. She's currently a faculty member in urban planning at University of Florida, though for the past almost a year she's been on sabbatical up at the University of Washington. So she didn't have to travel quite all the way from Florida today, just down from Seattle, and is going to present some of her research on concurrency, and specifically looking at Florida and Washington. And with that, I'm turning it over to you.
Thank you, Jennifer. Just to get a start on this, I'm not going to talk. I'm assuming that you all understand the reason we want to coordinate land use and transportation. And if you don't understand some of this rationale, we can talk about that as we move along. The idea behind concurrency is that we want to coordinate land use with investments in transportation. That is to say that, and it comes, the term concurrency comes from the language in the law in Florida that was passed in 1985 that said that transportation facility, infrastructure and facilities need to be available concurrent with the impact of development. So that explicitly said that these two things needed to be coordinated. How they're coordinated really is a matter, partly goes to what planning theory says, and partly it goes to how the act is implemented. The idea of concurrency is that you want consistency in your planning. And the idea, when we look at, and I should point out that concurrency is required for more than just transportation, although transportation has been the major area of concern in the state of Florida. And when we look at the state of Washington, it is done, local governments are required to do concurrency for.
I'm sorry. I'm sorry. Those lights are supposed to be off, so there's no glare out of the screen.
That's right. I hit that button. Maybe somebody's messed with it over here.
They went off for a second.
Restart?
Keep going, I'm sorry.
No, that's fine. So the idea behind concurrency is required in Florida for 6 or 7 different kinds of infrastructure, but most of the attention has gone to, I would say that 80% of the concern about concurrency has revolved around transportation, another 15% around schools, and the other infrastructure sort of fallen left to the side because transportation and schools really are driving investment. The idea behind concurrency is that you want the land use plan for the community, how the community is going to be developed, should drive the investments in transportation, and that should come together in what is called a capital improvements element. So the idea here is we coordinate land use and transportation, and the capital improvements element is how we fund that aspect of it. So basically it's driven by an idea in planning of consistency. 3 kinds of consistency: internal consistency, horizontal consistency, and vertical consistency that I'll describe in a moment. The idea of internal consistency is you want the plan to be internally consistent. You want the elements of the plan to be consistent with each other. Horizontal consistency is between adjacent jurisdictions. You don't want a situation where you have one county talking about very high development, high density development adjacent to the next neighboring community wants to have low density development. You want to have some sort of consistency across the board. And the idea of vertical consistency is that you want the local plans to be consistent with the regional plans, consistent with the aims of the state plan. and I'll get back to the idea of consistency later on in the discussion, but I want to talk about that as broadly why we think about concurrency and why it has been mandated in the states of Florida and Washington. I want to also distinguish concurrency from something called adequate public facilities ordinances, which are often called concurrency, but I would suggest that they operate a little bit differently because, in a sense, many local governments say we want to have infrastructure concurrent with its impact in our community. But often those are suburban communities who are also looking to increase the cost of living in those communities, and they're often seen as being used for suburban exclusion purposes rather than for policies across the state. So the idea of concurrency is that if you implement it in all jurisdictions, and that's what Washington and Florida did, was they said all jurisdictions who are participating in growth management are required to have concurrency in their local government planning efforts. So if we look at this, the other way to look at this is we have, in a sense, we have a state mandate of local governments in their planning process. And what I'm going to do now is talk a little bit about the history in both states and then the issues that are raised as we look at concurrency, and that's where you begin to get into the multimodal aspect of it. If we look at the two states, what you've got is the state of Florida they're both growing about the same rate. These rates are for the 1990s, and I haven't updated to recent, but they're growing about the same rate. But the state of Florida is probably 3 times the size of the state of Washington. And the other complexity in terms of thinking about growth management in the state of Florida is that the state has many urban areas: Miami, Tampa, Orlando, Jacksonville. Whereas the state of Washington, when you look at concurrency implementation, you really have this Puget Sound region, a little bit from Clark County, Vancouver area, which of course has some greater connections with Portland, and the Spokane region in recent years has begun to look at things. The legislation was passed in 1985 as part of Florida's Growth Management Acts. State of Washington passed their growth management in 1990. But even in doing so, they cited Florida's example for justifying the use of concurrency. Florida, as I mentioned earlier, requires concurrency for many forms of infrastructure, whereas Washington, it's required only for transportation, and even then, they're required to have a measurement of concurrency. And they're also, but they have at the local level, they can require concurrency for other forms of infrastructure. When we look at other minor differences in how these are done, if you look at the literature on growth management, Florida's growth management legislation is seen as top-down, state mandate, state review of plans, and a number of those things. Washington's is seen as being a little bit more of a negotiated fusion between between state, regional, and local. And that'll come into some of the analysis later. In terms of the state of Washington has what's called an Environmental Protection Act, which requires review of all development projects. The state of Florida does not mandate that kind of broad review of environmental impacts, which transportation impacts can be seen as a part of it, except for what's called developments of regional impact. And the developments of regional impact are those that are seen as having impacts beyond the county in which they're located. The evolution of concurrency, this is sort of broad, but if you really look at it, there's sort of 3 phases. The Growth Management Act being passed in 1985. The first set was plans were put together in the late 90s. At that point, it began to, the local governments started to say to the state, we've got a problem here. Because, especially in urbanized areas, we have the transportation infrastructure we're going to have. Acquiring additional land is going to cost more than we have in our plans, and to the extent that the remedy for concurrency was to shut down development, these communities were saying, we want redevelopment, we don't want transportation concurrency to shut down development in our communities. So that led to basically a review of the growth management legislation in the early 90s, recommended that some sort of exceptions be put in place for urbanized areas that were looking to do downtown revitalization, urban infill, and redevelopment kind of activities. And so the 1992 and 93, two different pieces of legislation were passed. I'll describe them in a little more detail later. In the late 90s was would be the start of the second phase, and that really was the first round of reviews after the plans were done. And there was a Transportation Land Use Study Committee that basically concluded that what a lot of people were saying about concurrency was that it was encouraging suburban sprawl. Now, I think when you hear that kind of claim, you have to ask the question, is it concurrency per se that's fueling suburban sprawl, or is it the fact that we don't have urban growth boundaries in the state of Florida, or that the land use regulations aren't strict enough so that if you look at a developer, that there's enough other disincentives to redevelopment? Is concurrency just another one of those examples of that? The bottom line, however, coming out of that was that they made a recommendation that the concurrency needed to address the fact that communities weren't planning for all modes of transportation. They were really based on the automobile instead of all modes. And it's somewhat different in politically, a different political environment in 2001. What could be seen as every 10 years or so we review our growth management, although this growth management study committee in 2001 was largely, the first three of those study committees were bipartisan. This 2001 was all Republicans and had a very different take on things. And I would say some of those recommendations led to 2005 Growth Management Reform Act, which is being sorted out as we speak. Our legislature's in session until May 4th, I believe. And every email I get back from Florida keeps telling me that many of the reforms proposed there were basically trying to get local governments to really take their impacts of development more seriously and really get financially feasible plans in place and be sure that they had enough funding supporting development. I'm told that there's been a backlash, so I've seen some legislation. It's all in all of you know, when you're dealing with the end of a legislative session, it's until you figure out what's going on, it's speculative at best to even figure out what's going on until it all sorts itself out. But if you really were to look at the policy discussion, there was a great deal of optimism when concurrency was put into the Act in 1985. It was seen by the then director of our Department of Community Affairs as the teeth of the Growth Management Act. It was going to be a part of this consistency. It was going to be a part of the way in which we get local governments coordinating with the regional level and at the state level. And a fundamental assumption under it was that new development should pay for itself, that it shouldn't be borne on the behalf of the community, people in the community, either through lowered quality of life or through higher taxes to pay for the new infrastructure. And the fundamental principle was that transportation infrastructure should be in place and available at the time of the impact of that development. All of those in some ways might be seen as naive looking 30 years later, or 20 years later, I should say. But the debate is really more switched around to concerns about multimodalism, the concern that the measure of concurrency was roadway level of service, and it did not accommodate other modes, and that it also led to widening of roads rather than thinking about would transit work in this situation? Could we build transit-oriented development? Could we put clusters, areas of greater walkability, all of those kinds of things? The other aspect is the backlog of projects. And we have to go back to when the Act was passed in 1985. There was a serious backlog of transportation projects in the state. The initial legislation called for investments, establishing a state infrastructure bank that would go to local governments to fund transportation, and that would have been funded through a services tax. 6 months after the growth management legislation passed, the services tax was repealed by the next governor. So for many years, the whole discussion of concurrency always focused on concurrency could have worked if we had had this infrastructure bank. There is no doubt, however, that the state reneged on its part of the bargain in terms of providing funding. And then you have the local governments feeling like this is an unfunded mandate. And I think that that part is the 2005 Act was attempting to reshuffle that deck. Where it comes out, as I said, is still being played out. But the other aspect of it, and one method that was attempted with the 2005 Act, was to require proportionate share methodologies at the local level, which would say if a developer comes in, if their project is in the local plan, they could pay their proportionate share of the cost of a transportation project. There was some backlash on that from local governments. There's a debate between the development community and local governments about how much the private sector portion of that infrastructure should be. So it's playing out as we speak, and there's some discussion about finding other methodologies of dealing with that, essentially the backlog of projects. The process in Florida is really built largely on this idea of coordinating your plan with what is called land development regulations, and that it be sort of done both at the plan level and then at the review of a specific project. So the idea is you establish level of service standards in the local comprehensive plans. Under the guidance of the State Department of Transportation, those were the standard level volume to capacity ratio, A through F. All of the engineering students know A is free flow, F is gridlock, and the idea being that you would say that this roadway segment ought to be meet this standard. So you would say it should be a level of service F, or a level of service D might be the kind of standard. And then in the land development regulations, you would say what happens if you don't meet that level of service standard. And on an annual basis or on a periodic basis, local governments review all of their major regional transportation network and determine how much capacity is left on that roadway. And then as a part of the development review, a new project comes in for 3,000 houses. You would say that there's an impact from 3,000 houses of about 30,000 trips per day, and then the question is, are there that many trips on the adjacent arterials? So you can see it's in the plan and establishing the level of service and monitoring it as projects come in. But basically what has happened through time is that there have been several modifications. Probably the most common one is to redefine the level of service standard in your plan. So when you're faced with a choice of a moratorium, you might say, well, we're going to allow gridlock here. So we're going to change the level of service from D to F. Or we might allow, and these last two sets are really what are project-specific exceptions or area-wide exceptions, and some of this becomes the alphabet soup of concurrency. I'm not going to bore you with the details except to sort of illustrate what the state legislature was attempting to do and what options were available to local governments to try to deal with the aspect of redevelopment and with projects in their existing urban centers. The urban redevelopment projects basically said if you have a site that's in need of redevelopment, so you might have a grocery store here that has, I don't even care about the size of it, but basically it's that if you have 6,000 trips allocated to this site, if you want to redevelop it, you're allowed to redevelop it at 110% of the number of trips allocated to that site. So you could go from 6,000 trips to 10% more, which would be 6,600. So in a sense, it's an incentive to redevelopment by saying you can develop at a greater intensity. The de minimis development is basically what's often called the mayor's castle. You don't want to burden small-scale projects with requirements that are disproportionate to the size of the impact. And you also don't want to prevent development. And basically the way this is set up is a certain threshold within the overall capacity of the roadway, that you can't exceed a certain number of thresholds on a certain corridor. The promotion of public transportation, you can again see the idea that we want the project, if it has reasonable transit service, to be able to be not again be burdened with some of the issues of roadway capacity completely, because it's a small encouragement to use of alternative modes of transportation. The part-time projects are things like arenas and stadium that have their peak. Their peak is at a different time period than the peak in the region, and it has less than 200 events per year. So again, the idea there is you don't want to turn down projects that would contribute to the cultural and recreational aspects of the community. The pay-and-go or fair share was at the options of local governments, although this began to be mandated. And the idea of the pay-and-go or fair share was that you could establish in your local government, in your local comprehensive plans, a means through which developers could pay for the impacts of their projects and would be able to proceed with development without necessarily having the facilities there at the time they would pay their fair share of a longer term project on the corridor in which they would have an impact. The management areas, and these are the general exception areas, the management areas you can see here promote infill or redevelopment that support more efficient mobility, including public transit. You'll notice here these were passed in 1992, and they're defined for compact geographical areas where multiple viable alternative paths or modes are available for common trips. These were set up in 1992, but never really, the rules on how they would be used by local governments were never really established, and they're not all that well heavily used because the exception areas were set up 1 year later, and it basically is a little bit more broader context, the idea of promotion of urban infill, redevelopment, and downtown revitalization. It really had to be a developed area rather than if you think of some things like redevelopment districts, which you can have blighted areas. This actually had to be developed in an urban fashion. And these are probably the most commonly used. I should note that these have had their standards increased in the 2005 legislation to require them to be multimodal. The long-term concurrency management system is really trying to deal with the backlog, and if you'll notice here, what they're basically doing is building a plan to eliminate the backlog of old projects. And instead of requiring it during the 6-year time frame, which is where most projects require, this is giving you 10 to 15 years to eliminate that deficit. And then the multimodal districts are attempting to really go one step beyond the exception areas. You simply don't get an exception area. You're really trying to build in a manner that we would call multimodal, which is you need to have a mix of land uses, interconnected grid streets, and densities and intensities to support all modes of transportation. And these also give preference to non-automobile modes of transportation. So there's transit-oriented development is one form of multimodal district, and a pedestrian-oriented environment is the other. The evolution in Washington is a little somewhat parallel. I would say, though, that Washington is probably in their first phase of evaluation of concurrency. 1990, the legislation passed. The early 90s, local governments developed comprehensive plans. Late 90s was the first set of evaluations of plans. And over the last really 6 to 7 years, there's been a series of assessments. First one in the Puget Sound region, and Clark County did an assessment of their concurrency system. 2005 legislation was passed encouraging local governments to do concurrency, multimodal concurrency. And in the last 2 years, there have been really 3 different studies, and this is largely the ones that I've been involved in. The Puget Sound has done a multimodal study to say, how do we make the system more multimodal? The Spokane region looked at whether they ought to do regional concurrency, and the Washington Department of Transportation looked at the state role in concurrency. In a large part, this was driven by one major difference between the states, and that is in Florida, the local governments do need to worry about concurrency and availability of capacity on the state highways of state significance, or in Florida they're called the Florida Intrastate Highway System, whereas in Washington the state roadways have been exempt from the system. And the problem the state of Washington has encountered, and there's a couple of, like many times in planning, there's sort of the extreme case that makes everyone aware that there's an issue, and the issue in Washington was believe it's a 30,000 unit housing development that had no concurrency for on any roadways because it had all of its access and egress on the state highway system. And of course, it had major impacts throughout the community, but it was exempted. There was no mitigation paid for this project, and there's many in the legislature for very good reasons who are very concerned about the exception of state roadway system from concurrency requirements. On the flip side, if the state does not have enough money to deal with deficiencies on their system, and so how can you ensure that you get local governments to behave well in spite of the exception from concurrency on state roadways? And in terms of understanding some of the things in the Puget Sound region, this is from the 2003 study by the PSRC, but if you can begin to see, what you find is that the state of Washington, because their mandate is less stringent, in Florida, the state DOT has put together all sorts of guidance for local governments, more heavy-handed, whereas in Washington there's much more opportunity for local governments. So the SEPA, the State Environmental Protection Act, 13% are adopting their concurrency through that rather than through the comp plans, whereas 10% in comp plans. And what you start to see in Washington is the difference between larger jurisdictions and smaller ones. The process is somewhat different again in Washington because there are these county-wide planning policies, which is a way of coordination between local governments and the county. They establish urban growth boundaries, and the regional transportation plans are developed through the Regional Transportation Planning Organization. So there, if you look at it from a land use perspective, there's a cooperation between the locals and the state. There isn't as much emphasis on local planning per se, and planning is done at the regional level. And the process here is the local governments establish the level of service, and how they measure level of service is much more, given greater flexibility. So some jurisdictions will use travel delay, average vehicle speed, person trip capacity, and a second part is that the projects are reviewed under both SEPA and mitigations dependent upon local regulations. So there is a little bit more local autonomy than arguably you might have in Florida. There's probably more of a set of guidance in Florida to which, and local plans are reviewed in Florida. So local governments there need to worry about following state guidelines, whereas there's a little bit more flexibility in Washington. So if we compare these two states, what we begin to understand, I'm quoting a little bit from these couple studies that I mentioned. In the 1998 study on transportation land use, now remember this is a legislative committee, both Republicans and Democrats participating. The underlying purpose is an important public purpose, however, as presently implemented, it has major shortcomings that should be addressed by the legislature. This was a concern about community design and multimodal planning. So that's part of what happened, and the state of Florida has begun to address those things. 2001 Growth Management Study Committee said there still does not exist a good linkage between future land use plans and infrastructure planning and budgeting. Concurrency is an inadequate tool for managing growth. I would suggest that concurrency is not the only tool for managing growth, so I quibble with this kind of conclusion. The fundamental flaw of concurrency is the presumption that population growth can be controlled on a project-by-project basis. While in fact, I mean, what this goes to, there's some truth to this, but I will quibble with it because the fundamental goal of concurrency is not to do concurrency management on a project-by-project basis. It's to plan the community and then have standards that you look at on a project-by-project basis. And that may sound like I'm mincing, that I'm finely slicing the words I'm saying, but the reality is that we're not trying to control population on a project-by-project basis. We're trying to establish, and if you really look at the exception areas, they're intending to say we have a plan for an area, sub-area of the city this is what the land use is going to look like. This is what the future transportation investments are going to look like. This is the financing plan to make this project become a reality. That's not really looking at a project-by-project basis. On a project-by-project basis, you say, how does this project fit into this broader plan? And I think that's where this kind of analysis falls short, is that there isn't enough discussion of that plan. There's probably been too much focus on the concurrency system itself. The Washington comparison, our programs are being refined and improved, but significant changes continue to be needed to make multimodal, coordinated, and fully supportive of the jurisdiction's comprehensive plans. And the changes are needed to address cross-jurisdictional impacts, but no clear consensus emerged. And I think this really actually says where the state of Washington is right now. We've completed the multimodal study on making concurrency more multimodal, and there's some legislative language going through it, but even within the Puget Sound region, our attempts to get the local governments to talk about what their priorities ought to be. We ended up in a meeting probably 2 months and a half ago where there seemed to be about 6 or 7 different agendas among the 20 or so people in the room, and little consensus on what the priorities ought to be within the range of options that we were offering. 2007 report says local concurrency programs focus almost exclusively on automobile congestion. That's could be said for really for both states. As density increases, roadway capacity becomes a poor proxy for the transportation system. Does not consider regional congestion except when through traffic's clog locally controlled roads. And this, in a sense, is one of the big challenges, both the multimodal side and the issue of regional roadways and how you fund them. So what is the status? If we look at these things, state of Florida, many jurisdictions are reducing the level of service standard. Some of that is dictated by the state, especially on state roadways, but once you get beyond that, there is some evidence from a study by Tim Chapin at Florida State that many local governments were sort of trying to ignore the concurrency system. About 30 communities are using these exception areas that I talked about, and they were quite diverse. I just completed a study last summer on that. Although what's somewhat troubling is, and the real issue with exception areas is, are they a way in which local government gets around the concurrency requirement, or are they a way in which they allow a local government to engage in context-sensitive and place-based coordinated land use transportation planning? And what we found was some local governments had exception areas, a small number, I think it was 3 out of about those 30, that said they were going to do an exception area. Our Department of Community Affairs believed they had an exception area. You looked at their local plans and there was no discussion of exception areas whatsoever. So I think that sort of says they're ignoring them. The second aspect is that 4 urban areas in the state, Miami-Dade County, Orlando, Tampa, and the city of Gainesville, literally the whole city in each of those cases is in an exception area. And arguably those probably should be more narrowly and more finely distinguished. And the classic example is Miami-Dade County has 128,000 acres in an exception area. Because there is a small loophole in the law that said urban services area rather than, and they were able to sort of average, even though there's density requirements, they could average the high density of downtown Miami with the lower density in more suburban contexts to be able to include it. And the other thing we began to see, we also looked at the plans, the Miami-Dade exception area includes 27 different communities. And what we found there was a very low rate of compliance with it, that when we looked at the 27 plans, there really were only a handful of communities that even mentioned that they had an exception area. There were a handful, or they actually were using the transportation concurrency management areas. Some of that being political, Miami Beach being an example where they used a management area because people in the community did not want to believe that developers should be accepted from anything. So an exception area was not applicable, but it has the same intent as the management area. So there's this question of compliance is really an important question. Another jurisdiction we looked at was Collier County, which is on the southwest Florida, and basically they were using an exception area in what was a suburban area. It did not support all modes of transportation. It was low density, segregated suburban style development with limited transit access. And I don't know that I would ever want to find myself walking in that area because I didn't have, everything seemed to be so far apart that I couldn't figure out why you would want to walk there. The exception areas are little but increasing use of management areas and long-term concurrency management systems. I would say that some of this is a function of the state holding local governments responsible for making sure that they deal with concurrency, especially when it impacts the state roadways. And the multimodal districts that I mentioned, which can be used both in a redevelopment context and in a new development context, are just beginning to be developed because the rules are relatively new. But what they are, the impact they are starting to have is where you have the one example is Destin, which is a resort community where they have a great deal of trouble on their state highway through the community. And what it's forced them to do is to build parallel capacity and to build a better roadway grid so that they can keep some of the traffic off of the major arterial. Status in state of Washington, no two programs are the same. There's some debate and some discussion about the use of exceptions. I worked in Spokane on the project on regional concurrency there, and the policymakers in that area seem to be saying that there were no exceptions allowed, whether they were project exceptions or area-wide exceptions, whereas in Western Washington, especially in the city of Seattle, basically has the whole city is effectively an exception area by virtue of saying we only measure level of service in one location, or a small number of locations. So that whole question of, on the other hand, because the laws are locally based, there's a great deal more flexibility in how they're being used. But I would say they're being used cautiously to the extent that most jurisdictions are, at least in the first phase, we're really using some sort of capacity-based system. But what is encouraging in some is beginning to see local jurisdictions saying, what does our future land use plan for 30 years look like? What is the transportation system to support that? And how do we make the financing plan work between the public sector and the private sector, which is really what I see as the intention of concurrency. Innovations are occurring because the local governments can use different ways of measuring this, and really goes to the choice of measurement system. As they always say, what you measure counts and what counts is measured. And I think this is sort of an example where the places that have gone away from the simple volume to capacity are really saying, you know, travel time might be a better metric. Multimodal travel time may be an even better metric. But the issue really of measurement, however, is you sort of may create greater difficulty with adjacent jurisdictions cooperating if you use different measures within your concurrency system. And so it means you probably have to more carefully craft that. And then this whole issue of state facilities is something being discussed, and Washington is also, in the last couple weeks of the legislative session, there is an active bill that may change some of that, but we'll see where it ends up by the end in another month or so. So basically, if you look at the two of them together, what you find is that the program is really evolving in each state. But you have to go back to the fundamental purpose of concurrency. It is to provide transportation infrastructure concurrent with the impact of development. And that really implies both a coordination of land use with transportation, which I think is something that we're struggling with. But the other aspect really is that this implies a funding source. And I think the dilemma is that neither state really, both states are low tax, low fiscal capacity kind of states, and both of them comment on serious backlogs, and they both went into concurrency with backlogs, and the backlogs haven't gotten any better. And some of this goes to the willingness to turn down projects because their impacts are significant, or the willingness to have a moratorium on development in states that are generally pretty pro-growth. And I think both states are really struggling with that issue at the moment in different ways. Florida attempting to do this proportionate share, but the proportionate share not coming into place. Washington, with their exempting state highways, in a way is saying we're not going to invest in state highways, or we don't have the money to deal with the backlog on state highway projects. But essentially, I would say that what really both of them have come to is the need to customize the tools to specific contexts. And I would say, suggest for instance, each state has really dealt with the urban condition in the sense that Florida has said we have these exception areas that are available to urbanized areas. Washington has said, local governments, you need to define solutions that work for your community. And when it comes to rural, Washington does not require the Growth Management Act for all of their communities. The counties that have relatively low population and low rates of growth are not required to be in the Growth Management Act. So in some respects, the rural communities are accepted. The dilemma in Washington, though, that I had not thought about was that Washington has urban growth boundaries. But what it means, in effect, is that their areas are either defined as rural or urban. But the urban designation includes both suburban and urban areas. And in some respects, when we're looking at land use and transportation coordination and the implementation of concurrency, the kinds of local programs you put in place are going to be very different for urban environments than they are going to be for suburban environments. So for instance, frequency of transit service may be applicable in an urban context, and this, to a lesser extent in a suburban context, because you probably don't have the coverage of transit, but park and ride parking spaces may make sense as a form of measurement within a concurrency system. And as I've mentioned, both of these really have this issue of fiscal capacity. But if we begin to look at these, what I'm going to do now is sort of go through the state, local, and then have some final comments. Basically, we need to go back to remembering the planning environment within the states. And when they were implemented, Florida's really was implemented as top-down. The local governments have their plans reviewed and approved by the State Department of Community Affairs. State of Washington is a fusion and really has this much more local jurisdictions. Well, in Florida, local jurisdictions can comment on the plans, but I've found very little evidence of that, whereas in Washington that's a little more common, and even there are some examples of, especially in east side cities in the Puget Sound, of sharing of impact fees, the classic example being Redmond sharing some of the impact fees with Bellevue because the Microsoft campus had significant impacts on the city of Bellevue. The other difference really is this idea of state guidance on concurrency, which has been in place, and that in Florida has gone from being basically the level of service handbook to now it's a multimodal handbook. And in Florida, our Department of Transportation has done a lot of work on measurements of pedestrian and bicycle level of service, really as a part of developing the multimodal districts and a way in which local governments can begin to think about not just automobile level of service, but really multimodal level of service. And then the other example, other difference in the state role is this whole question of protection. Do we want to protect the level of service on state highways, or how do we want to do that? Arguably, some of the issues in Florida is that really goes to economic base, and Florida's economics being based on tourism, and the need to move tourists between cities may in fact be driving the protection of the level of service on state highways. The regional role, I think, Florida's regional planning is much more fragmented. There are 26 different MPOs in the state of metropolitan planning organizations. Washington, in contrast, has both the federal MPOs, which are required for communities of over 50,000 in population, but they also have these regional transportation planning organizations. So the two of them are sort of merged into a system. I've got maps here. Unfortunately, this map isn't as clear as it could be, but if you look at the shaded areas, there are, in fact, basically coastal, and then this is like the Tampa Bay. But if you use Tampa Bay as an example, the Tampa Bay area is 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 different MPOs, or 5 different MPOs for one major metropolitan area, and the issue of coordination of that region falls to the State Department of Transportation. But there is no attempt at the local level to get cooperation in regional planning. Whereas Washington's, that's built into this to a large extent. You can see multiple county MPOs or regional. There's multiple county MPOs and there's regional transportation planning organizations that facilitate some of that regional transportation planning. And so what you really see is a limited role of regional agencies in Florida, and except to the extent that the 2005 Act called for Transportation Regional Incentive Program, which requires two adjacent jurisdictions, so it has to be multi-county, where they can fund regional roadway systems that provide capacity, alternative capacity of the state highway system. And there's some state matching to try to encourage these local expenditures. I can't really comment on how effective those have been to this point, except to say that there have been many examples of the TRIP, Transportation Regional Incentive projects being proposed at least. Whereas in Washington you have a really much stronger recognition of the need for local and regional, and but the issue really that continues to come up is the whole issue of funding of multimodal regional capacity. Local role, this is just summarizing. We both have local concurrency programs, capacity-based measures with limited exceptions. This is how multimodal planning is done at the local level, whereas we have much more of a variety of approaches to concurrency, although most of them are using capacity-based. So in some respects, we almost have the same result, even though one could arguably be more state-heavy, the other being the local government. And really what that suggests is that transportation planning practice and engineering really are influencing the outcomes maybe as strongly as the legislation. The difficulty of coordination across jurisdictions, partly because we have weak coordination in Florida, whereas in Washington the variety of approaches in some respects can make coordination across communities more difficult. And if we look at the local role, what we have is, in terms of funding, I would say that we have great variety. These are laboratories of democracy at their finest. Focus on capacity in Florida, except where exceptions are used, whereas Washington has this variety of mitigation approaches. Impact fees seem to be more well established within the Washington context, or more well accepted than in Florida, although I would say it continues to evolve in Florida. Proportionate share requirements I've seen in many local government plans, whereas in Florida it's in the process of being rejected and sort of playing out as we speak. In Florida, I would say and both states to some extent, although there's probably a little bit more coordination because of the requirement of these county planning goals, whereas in Florida the competition between cities and counties is pretty fierce, and a part of that really relates to annexation rules in Florida, which require voluntary annexation. And basically, to sum this up, the concurrency system has evolved. Concurrency really provides the tool for local governments to plan for infrastructure. And I could say that it's seen as good planning. One of the things, though, that we don't talk about as much about in Florida but in Washington is that the dilemma of this, if we really think about this from a standpoint of consistency, both states really encourage consistency within the plans, but the lack of money at the local level sometimes make the capital improvements element the weak link of that coordination. Washington probably does a better job of coordination, what we would call horizontal consistency, that is local adjacent jurisdictions trying to be sure their plans work together. And there really is, in Washington, a move to look at vertical consistency in the sense of local plans for land use coordinating with local, with regional plans for land use. But the dilemma is there is no what we would call regional coordination of the land use transportation system. That is, you have different, there's, at the regional level you might coordinate land use and you coordinate transportation, but that doesn't mean you're coordinating the two of them simultaneously at the regional level. And that, I think, is the next sort of challenge within this. And really, I think so basically what we have is, it's really remained controversial in these states. I've heard that in Florida they were proposing to do away with concurrency once again. But there is, I think there sort of is a resignation. It doesn't work, but it's the best we have. I know that may sound a little bit odd, but you know, and I've started asking the question, what other forms of coordination could you do? And I don't think there is anything quite, I mean, there are other plans, and this is sort of where I'm going with, starting to go with my research, to say, you know, the advantage of, if you think about this, what concurrency does is it packages up, in theory it packages all these levels of consistency. In practice, there's some issues that get left by the wayside, but I don't believe that there's any other coordination that attempts to coordinate state to regional to local and land use to transportation in the same way. And other lessons we have here, I think this, and that squarely goes with the issues of regional approaches. As I've said, there are some people who say, well, concurrency is failing, but I say, I would respond to that with the fact that you can't look at concurrency in isolation from all of the other planning activities that are going around, which is, if it's too easy to develop on the urban fringe, why are you going to have redevelopment? So just putting an exception into place may not, what it may do is draw attention, and if you put it in place with a reduction in the impediments to development review, for instance, you may be able to encourage it. But there's so many aspects of development that go beyond concurrency, that go beyond planning, that go with, for instance, the putting together assembly of land. The reality is it's more expensive to build, it can be more expensive to build in cities than on the fringe. So you can't look at this simply as concurrency is a failure, because it is using roadway capacity as a measure, and it tends to encourage development in the edge, because in fact, if you begin to look at it from a multimodal perspective, you begin to see that possibly can overcome that bias towards automobiles. So another aspect of it is the coordination with other transportation demand tools. You can't simply look at concurrency. You need to say, what are the other? So Washington's CTS, the employee commute reduction system, could be tied into that, although that's there's another whole set of issues associated with that. And then this management of state highway systems will remain an issue. And what I really would say is, what we've seen in this evolution has been basic concurrency, which says very simplistically, we're going to measure concurrency by looking at roadway systems capacity, to we're going to do place-based concurrency. What makes the most sense for the place in which we're located? And I would say that I see the exception areas in Florida as an example of what I would call place-based concurrency rather than basic concurrency. And I'm not going to go into that one. But the other issues really come to measurement. And I think this is another area where I argue in another paper that's coming out, it's a chapter in a book, that basically if you look at concurrency and the evolution of transportation tools, that when it was implemented in 1985, we were just beginning to recognize the need to coordinate land use and transportation. But it is fair to say that the kinds of tools available to do that at the local level were pretty limited. And even as we look forward, and that is to say that even if you wanted to make an argument that a better interconnected grid with high density and mixed land use is going to reduce your transportation impacts, and therefore you ought to reduce the impact fees that a developer pays, you would have had a difficult time, and even today you have a difficult time finding empirical data to support that. I mean, while we have a large number of studies, and we can believe that in certain contexts we can reduce the impacts. What we don't know is how much those impacts can be reduced. We don't have know with any certainty that in certain contexts that those impacts will happen. We don't know what mix of land uses will reduce those impacts. So there's a number of issues that we know more today than we did 20 years ago, but the dilemma is we may believe we ought to measure this multimodal, that we should do something other than roadway capacity, but if not roadway capacity, then what? And fundamentally some of this goes to, can we really control congestion? When in fact what we're really attempting to do, and maybe the dialogue needs to be changed here from we're not trying to control congestion. What we're really attempting to do is create an environment in which people like to be, and that follows what is the vision of the community, what is the land use that is needed to achieve that vision, what is the transportation facilities that support that level of development, and ultimately maybe the idea is to minimize the impact of the use of the concurrency system. So with that, I'll take questions.
I was just curious on why exactly did you compare Washington and Florida? I mean, I know they're really far apart. They have a lot of similarities and differences. I would just think that some other states would be more similar to Florida's concurrency than Washington.
That's a great question. I guess I didn't make it clear enough up front. The states of Washington and Florida are the only two states in the country that mandate concurrency of all of their local governments. Arguably, there are many other contexts in which other kinds of coordination of land use and transportation is required. Maryland experimented with something called priority funding areas, for instance. Pennsylvania has had some systems to try to deal with coordination across jurisdictions, try to create incentives at the state level for local adjacent jurisdictions to cooperate. But I would suggest, and California has several examples. San Diego area has long been known for coordination of land use and transportation. But there's only two states that have mandated this of all of their local governments. Yes.
As I was sort of thinking about this, I mean, it seems like one thing when we talk about coordinating land use and transportation, clearly concurrency, that's the idea, is to coordinate, to time it concurrently. And I guess it's a little different, it seems like, particularly being in Portland, when we talk about coordinating land use and transportation, I think the implication is more that that Portland in this region is using land use to affect travel demand instead of just coordinating it. And I'm wondering if, and it sounds like some people have concluded that in Florida, for example, that maybe, it's just causing sprawl, et cetera. And I know this is a lengthy question, but if there was, is there any way that the concurrency could be pushing, aside from these multimodal areas, but more fundamentally trying to change the actual land use? Is there a way to either change the system, or I don't know?
Well, one way that I really think about this is that a fundamental, and it really ties into how concurrency is implemented, in theory, what I believe we want to do, and I did a study in 2002 called Multimodal Trade-offs and Traffic Impact Studies, wherein I reviewed sort of the state of practice. And what I found was the system, in many of the functions in the system in Portland, where you have modal plans that, and general ideas, if you develop in a certain part of the city, this is kind of a mode split you'd end up. That's much better data than is available in lots of regions, but that's the kind of data that you really need in order to think about how you would change the incentives and it could be done within a concurrency system. So for instance, if you knew with some certainty that you have two developments, they're identical, 100,000 square foot shopping center, and you're looking at two different contexts, one's the more suburban and one's more urban. If you knew with some certainty that you were going to have a certain rate of internal well, why don't we say it's a mixed-use project, but I don't want to get caught up on that, but except to say you have two identical contexts. If you knew that you were going to have higher level of internal capture, different mode split, multiple ways for people to get there rather than all of the traffic going on the major arterial. If you knew with some certainty you could have a proportionate reduction of the impact fees or the concurrency mitigation fees in the urban context that you would on the suburban context. Except that we don't have, at least in Florida context, we don't have good numbers on how much that would boil down to. I mean, the other way to think about that also would be VMT charges, which is to say, if you were to look at trips, if you think about what underlies transit-oriented development and multimodal development, is that you don't know if you have the same number of trips or fewer trips. You don't have as many auto trips. And when you do have auto trips, the distance traveled is shorter. So if you could begin to come up with a metric, you could in fact say that you're going to have reduced impacts, and you could reduce the impact fees or the fees associated with development proportionately.
So that actually may be a quicker question I've been wondering about. I know the state of Florida has been pretty innovative in developing like the bicycle level service and pedestrian level service, and it's sort of surprising to see that coming from Florida, at least what others of us think of this state. But is the state doing anything to try to, develop data like new trip reduction or trip generation factors for mixed use, or are they gathering any of that data to show that these things might have fewer trips?
Yes and no. I mean, I've been involved. I've actually just proposed on a project there's some and some of this relates to this discussion. I said the 2005 legislation called for proportionate share, and that's fallen. It's become extremely controversial, and there's a lot of discussions going on that I'm not privy to, but I keep hearing about from a distance, that there is, for instance, this VMT. There is some interest in trying to look at whether you could do VMT-based fee system. There is, for instance, on the there's a lot of little pieces of work, but we're trying to put it all together. So you mentioned the bicycle pedestrian level of service. The other side of that is, and in some respects, the bicycle and pedestrian level of service really looks at facilities. So supply side, there's also been some attempts to begin to look at latent demand for those kinds of things. But as you know, that a lot of those, especially validating those models, is difficult until you start having good data on the number of pedestrians or bicyclists in any specific context. And I would say that that's, we're beginning to develop. There is a study on Conserve by Bicycle where they're actually doing counts on a number of different facilities to try to, keep gathering the data. So there is, if you really sort of look at this, you're saying we have this existing system that we know is automobile-based and not accounting for multimodal planning. And we know we want to evolve to the multimodal, and the question is, how do you find a way that you take this and move it over here? And of course, there's always the controversy about, there is always the question of should you know, some people question the use of bicycle and pedestrian level of service because they say you're taking a system that's broken and building on it instead of trying to build a system that doesn't have some of the inherent limitations of the existing system. And, you know, we could spend hours debating the approach, except to say that, yes, there is an attempt. I don't know that it's a systematic, and there's only so many resources to do that. Yes, ma'am?
So you were mentioning that in the state of Washington, local jurisdictions are doing a fairly good job of coordinating their plans with one another, but what about the actual implementation, like the level of service standards you were saying? They're different for each one. How does that play down on that level when the plans are the same but the actual measurements are different?
I don't have good examples of that except to say, I guess the question is if you were to go to a regional system, you would have a difficult, the discussion of a regional system, and that's probably a better example, is that the regional, when we were looking at the Spokane region, one of the discussions was about needing to have jurisdictions use the same metric. Now, I'm not as convinced that you need to have the same metric. I am convinced, however, which is to say, but you need some that they're compatible enough that when you don't create too much effort to try to comply with both the local, because there's some discussion in Washington about a local concurrency system and a regional concurrency system, which is part of what was it's been discussed in both the Puget Sound region and the Spokane region. And the issue of you have local governments without a lot of capacity, and all of a sudden you're saying they may want to measure it one way for very valid local reasons, but you may want to have a different metric at the regional level, and some metrics are not going to be consistent with each other because they may require new data that you don't have at the local level in order to do the regional level system. And I mean, it's a great question. But I think you have to look at it sometimes at the specific context, because some systems are, for instance, a capacity system in one jurisdiction and a multimodal capacity system in another, in a sense, they're compatible even though they're different systems. Whereas one system that looks at travel time may or may not be consistent with a capacity-based system. Yes, sir?
There are two basic components in a concurrency system, the land use piece and the transportation piece. And it seems like since the outset the focus has been on how do we raise enough money to fund the transportation system given the land use piece. So the variable has been transportation. In Washington, in the last 4 years, the legislature has raised the gas tax 13.5 cents, which is going to raise $20 billion over the next 16 years. Even with that, there's not enough money to fund the type of roadway systems that feed low-density segregated development. And so they're actually looking at yet another regional transportation measure this November. I'm wondering if you're familiar, and the legislature, interestingly enough, simultaneously, they're looking at actually taking transportation dollars, I believe, for the first time in Washington, and funding land use improvements through this concept called Growth and Transportation Efficiency Centers.
Yes.
Through the commute trip reduction program.
Yes.
Tiny amount of money, but very innovative program. Are you aware of anywhere else in the country that is looking at, instead of just trying to throw more money at the transportation system, either the road system or the transit system, actually changing the other variable, the land use, in a systematic way to try to meet concurrency requirements?
Well, concurrency, remember, is only exercised in the state of Washington and Oregon, Washington and Florida. So if we sort of begin with that, I would say what you're doing here is, in a sense, I don't know whether you're shifting money, but you certainly are looking at alternative solutions. San Francisco Bay Area there has been certain incentive programs to do transit-oriented development. State of Vermont has looked at growth centers. I'm not sure how that falls on transportation effect. But I actually think that if you go back to the ICE-T legislation of 1991, in some respects the enhancements program also builds on that. It doesn't directly pay for land use kinds of solutions, but the CMAQ program, to the extent that it may support infrastructure in a different way, is encouraging. I mean, I guess I'm going towards multimodal and equating that with land use, but I think you can equate them in some ways, which is to the extent that if you don't think in a multimodal way, investments in transit-oriented development and other alternative land transportation solutions aren't going to work unless you begin to find a way to shift things over to multimodal side. So the multimodal efforts, while still transportation-based, are encouraging the land use side more directly than highway-based investments. Yes, Jennifer?
I'm not asking, I'm actually, Ken Duker is watching on the web. Hi, Ken. And has sent in a question via email. And he asks, is concurrency a more difficult challenge in Washington due to state-mandated growth targets?
I'll have to be honest, I haven't, if he could elaborate on the state-mandated growth targets, that would be helpful to me.
I wasn't familiar with that growth target idea either, so maybe he'll email us back.
Okay, great. Okay, well, yes, if you want to talk about them, that would be helpful. I mean,
I can't necessarily speak for somebody else, but the state does require that jurisdictions meet 20-year growth, that their plans meet 20-year growth projections that come out of the State Office of Financial Management. And so the state says this is how many people and how many jobs we anticipate over the next 20 years. Your plans have to accommodate at least.
Oh, okay. I mean, Florida does the same thing. I mean, I guess where I'm confused is the use of the term state growth mandates, because the way I understand the way that's done in Washington is that the state has projections are made about the rate of growth in the state, and so they may say that we expect a rate of growth of 20% over the next decade and whatever. They have this amount and then they allocate it throughout the state. Florida does a similar thing where our Bureau of Business and Economic Research says the state expects this amount of growth. We expect X amount per county, and then the local planning has to figure out how we're going to address it. Is that the same? Have you gotten a response back from Ken? Okay. Well, because when I hear the term state growth mandates, I'm assuming that they're saying you have to grow by this month because of an economic development imperative. That's very different than saying the state expects to grow by this amount and we expect to allocate it here. But I think, well, how do you think this through? If you think about concurrency in a sense, it seems to me it creates a tension between local and state. And concurrency does the same thing, because it is basically taking what is essentially the state is saying to local governments, you need to deal with the growth impacts associated with growth. And to the extent that it is unfunded, and to the extent if in fact it's saying you need to accommodate this much growth, then you end up in a negotiation. Now, the question I don't know the answer to is what is the extent to which local governments in Washington can say to the state, you want us to grow by X number, and we don't have any way to accommodate that, and we're not willing to do that under concurrency.
If developers have to pay a fee when congestion is increased, that should provide the finances needed to improve the transportation system. That's the idea behind it, right?
I think you're confusing a couple things I said, or didn't say. There are, the reason I talk about this as congestion is that when you use a volume to capacity measure, you are assuming that you're dealing with traffic congestion as your measurement that drives your concurrency system. I wanted to then distinguish that from something, a source of funding that increasingly is being considered by local governments, which would be called congestion pricing, wherein you would pay a certain amount of money for if you travel during peak hour and there's traffic congestion. So the Puget Sound region actually just completed the King County just completed a study on congestion fees. Both of them would raise revenue, and the congestion pricing in the Puget Sound region actually would eliminate a certain amount of the backlog, and it may create money to deal with capacity on the regional roadway system, or even funding for regional transit projects. But I think in a way what it does is the congestion pricing offers an opportunity to reduce the impact possibly on development and a means to eliminate some of the backlogs of development projects. On the other hand, they how they're structured and all of those things will impact both what they're used for and the extent to which they're multimodal or simply used for automobile systems. I have a question up front here.
Yeah. Why concurrency doesn't apply on state roads?
The dilemma and the nature of that discussion in Washington has been that if there is roadway congestion on state highways and the local government is being told that they need to mitigate for that, then you start to get into and the state does not have enough money for transportation projects. You get into a battle over who ought to pay for the cost of remedying the traffic congestion problem on a state road facility in a local community. And some of it, what goes with it that I didn't talk a lot about is that the flip side of it in Florida is that the State Department of Transportation does all they can to protect the level of service on their roadways. And what that may mean is that they may engage in solutions that have a major impact on the local community. They may reduce the access and egress. They may reduce the number of interchanges in urban areas because they don't want to serve local trips. Whereas in Washington, there is an acceptance that the state highway system may be used by the local government for what is essentially local trips. So it's part of really what I would say is a different approach to thinking about roadway capacity between the two states that may be driven by the economic imperatives of the regions. I've had some of those discussions in Washington. That's why I said, to some extent the argument in Florida for protecting capacity in the state is that one of our economic engines is tourism from other states. So if people are going to keep getting stuck in traffic in Jacksonville because they're driving along I-95, that the state interest is in fact in protecting the level of service on their roadway because they want people to be able to get further south beyond Jacksonville to other parts of the state. Whereas in Washington you may not have as much emphasis on tourism, and you may have, arguably, this is sort of, I'm in the area of speculation, but you don't necessarily, the economy of Washington is definitely not as tourist-oriented as Florida. There's no doubt about that. Although arguably there may be freight movement arguments for protecting capacity in roadways in Washington.
Any last question? Thank you very much, Ruth. Oh, wait, I'm sorry. Oh, I'm sorry. I didn't see your hand. Sorry.
Just flew to my mind about congestion and roadway capacity and these things. Is there a way to encourage like making double-decker maxes and buses so they are not long in length, they are like tall or high, and so we have many of them and they go to different places, so we increase trip times. And they can go everywhere. And about funding, why don't we like encourage people by awareness so people can donate, or we can increase taxes or things like that?
Okay. I'm going to ask you to elaborate a little bit on your second one. Okay, I'll answer the first. The first question is, in fact, if you look at the state of Washington, the Puget Sound region especially, what they have done on their transit system, I think, actually is quite amazing, in my mind, compared to Florida, just because, although if you look at the statistics on transit use, the southeast of the United States is one of the places that does not work, and Florida would be included, although I think Florida transit may be better than other places in the southeast. I speak without having looked at that closely. Washington, but what you find in Washington is actually pretty high capacity and HOV lanes throughout the region to prevent transit buses from getting stuck in traffic. They aren't necessarily using double deckers, but they are using the articulated buses that have they have greater capacity than just the 47 or 50 passenger buses. So there's different. I think there's different technology. I don't even know if double deckers buses would work in many contexts if the bridges are too low. Okay.
Okay. Thank you very much, Ruth, for coming and joining us today.
Thank you.